Hi, good morning. As was said, I'm a political scientist from the University of Jerusalem, dealing with all things political wherever I can find them. I'm also a resident of Jerusalem. I've been a resident for almost 50 years, wandering around the city. And while being presenting here as part of a project that looks at the project looks at several divided cities, which are also capitals and are also post-colonial cities, and trying to see relationships between these various characteristics. And the project focuses on the symbolic landscape of the city. And here I'll be presenting one first shot or one part of this project, which deals with a street that most of you are probably familiar with, not very far from here, Gaza Street, Gaza Road, and things that one can learn about politics from wandering around the street and looking at it. And I'm very grateful for this conference because it gave me a chance to kind of put together bits and pieces of this project. And I'll be happy to hear what you think about it. So what I'm looking at in this paper are formal and informal efforts to shape the symbolic landscape in Jerusalem by focusing on, as I said, on one street, on Gaza Street or Gaza Road. Both names are used interchangeably, and attempts to normalize it in recent years. And I rely on theoretical and empirical advancement in studying place names, including works on street names, and I have a number of people working on that. And these works suggest that street names and other place names are not only do not only have functional meaning and functional purposes, in other words, to help people get from one point to another, but also have political meaning. And what I do in this paper, I examine using maps, archives, social media, and strolling, going up and down Gaza Street, different formal and informal layers of place naming in Gaza, in the street, and asking about their political significance. So some necessary background on the street. Here you have one of the street signs. There are quite a few, and I'll talk about them later. It's right in the middle of the unified Jerusalem. I'll talk about three periods in the history of the street. The first one is before Israel's statehood, during the Mandate period. It's an old street. It's a well-known street. And it has a very functional purpose to lead people out of Jerusalem towards Gaza. And it's one of several streets that are named after other cities in Palestine: Jaffa, Hebron, Bethlehem, Gaza, and Jericho. And this is actually a British document saying what are the borders of the street. It begins with King George Street. It goes all the way to the municipal boundary of the city. And you're probably familiar with the place on your right. You see the pillbox down there. This was actually the end of the city. So Gaza led all the way to that. And beyond there, was nothing. There was Malcha and other villages, but not part of Jerusalem. These are the, as I said, the roads. I circled them that go to the various other cities in Palestine. Now comes the state of Israel in 1948 and leaves these functional names intact. It doesn't change them. What it does do is change the streets themselves. Gaza Road is interesting because it is cut up into bits and pieces. Most of it is appropriated and becomes Herzog Street, named after the grandfather of the current president, Rabbi Herzog, in 1962. Here below you have the invitation to the naming of the street after him, and Gaza becomes, as I'm saying here in the title, a road to nowhere. It doesn't lead to Gaza. Gaza anyway is under Egyptian rule at that time. There's no use there's no functional meaning to it. It just becomes an ordinary road, but it's still named Gaza Road nonetheless. But it's quite long at the beginning of the period and quite short at the end of it. This is it today, stuck between Agon Street and Herzog Street. The So this is the second period of Israeli rule. Then things become more complex because, and this has to do with the conflict with the Palestinians. There are two major bombings in the upper part of Gaza Street. One in, this is the newer building. It used to be the Moment Cafe. Actually, I have nearly avoided that blast. I was there a week before, 2002. And then the second one on the corner of Arlozov Street and Gaza Street, there was a bus blown up there. And later with all the events in Gaza, Gaza Strip, Hamas taking control of Gaza in 2007. So people in Jerusalem become uncomfortable with the name Gaza. And residents and city council members call upon the municipality to change the name and find another name for Gaza Road, Gaza Street. There are several instances where that happens. But despite these calls and pleas, the name remains on the maps and street signs, on the houses. But what you do see are all kinds of attempts to normalize the street, to make it, making it less threatening, more comfortable for Israelis, more welcoming to Israelis, I would argue. And you can notice that going up and down the streets, and I'll show you some examples now. So first of all, the street signs. Now it's a mess. One of the things that made me so interested in Gaza Street is the inconsistencies in the street names. I actually, a week ago or so, I went up and down the street and tried to see the various ways in which the street is written, and note that almost none of them is the name of the city of Gaza. That's in Arabic. There's only two signs. There's no English name of the Gaza, with the name Gaza, which is the name of the city of Gaza. And even in the Hebrew signs, there is an inconsistency. Some call it Rexov Gaza Street, some call it Gaza Road. It's very messy. And the same goes for the houses. I actually tried to count the signs on the houses. Most of them just say Gaza. And some say street, road in English, again, very messy in Arabic. Some even translate it literally Rexov Gaza or Derech Gaza. And when I talk about informal naming, you see the lower sign. It's not a municipal sign. It's just someone put a sign on his house. And I suggest that even using the name Gaza, and not using the name of the street even makes it closer to Gaza, the place Gaza. So one could, if you look at these street signs and on the houses and the street, and this is important, there's no description of what Gaza means. If you go to Jaffa Street, you see that Yaffo was the port city of Jerusalem during the ancient period. In Gaza, there's no description on any of these signs. I think that's significant. There's no consistency. Well, sometimes it's Gaza, sometimes it's road, sometimes it's a street. The newer signs in English and Arabic are even more distance the street name from the city of Gaza, using all these weird forms, especially in Arabic, for those who read Arabic. And so, as I mentioned, some of the many names use only the name Gaza without specifying the street or a road. And what's interesting, and this is good for a person like me, that they're all on top of one another. These are layers and layers and layers of signs, of names, and this mess is very interesting, as you can see, because you can learn things from it. You can see things that were before and newer ones, and this is a lot of work can be done about that. Okay, now there are also efforts to rename the street. These are two of them, one after one of the operations against Gaza in 2014, Protective Edge, to Kaitan. The other is a letter to Haaretz calling upon the mayor Nir Barkat to rename Gaza as Ezer Weizmann, the former president. This guy was actually a consultant to Ezer Weizmann. He doesn't disclose that in the letter, but I Googled him and saw that he was a journalist and advisor to Ezer Weizmann. But this didn't materialize. The name remains. And these are things that anyone going up and down Gaza Street will probably notice. All these, I don't know how to call them, ventures or projects, like cultural projects, like Gaza is moving, which is kind of plays on the theme of take Gaza and maybe move it somewhere, maybe as far as possible from Israel. Einstein in Gaza by the Hebrew University. Some of my colleagues actually didn't like the idea of, they thought it was insulting to the Palestinians. Actually, now it's called Gaza, בעיר, or something like Gaza in town, or the Einstein in town, or something else. But there were several years where it was called Einstein in Gaza, closing the street and having all these happenings there, cafes and stuff, Rachel, all kinds of cultural events. And all sorts of, again, if you walk up and down the street a lot, you would notice all these posters, colorful, okay? This one's with the trees and all that. It's a house under construction, and it's painted like you're somewhere in this paradise somewhere, and I don't know, in Thailand or in, all these colorful posters with רחוב, the language of the street, and this nice construction of the White House and all that. And all this is mounted in Gaza, the street, all along the street. And it's not a very big street or long street, so you notice that once you go up and down the street, you cannot avoid it. So some conclusions, and I hope I have a minute to sum up. So, and this is not news. This will not be news to you, that the city's symbolic landscape is significant. I would also argue that it's politically significant. One can identify elements of continuity and change in it across time and space. Place names can change. A functional name can become a political name and vice versa. This is one of the interesting things that you can learn from Gaza Street. Changes in the place that the street represents, meaning the city of Gaza and its relations with the street's location. Jerusalem, Israel, can affect the street's name. More attention should be given to formal and informal efforts to shape the city's symbolic landscape, including place names. And this is a question for you guys in the conference. How can we document and analyze the city's symbolic landscape and the unending formal and informal efforts to shape it? Because in this presentation, I tried to show that this is something that's going on repeatedly. And each time that you go, or every month or year, when you go up and down the street, you see something new. So how do we catch that in our net? And how do we archive that? Thank you very much.